Awesome. Wow, thank you for that. That was a very great introduction. And as much as I maybe one day wish I did run the department, I do not. I am the archives librarian for the USF Tampa Special Collections Library because we do have another special collections on our St. Pete campus, if you didn't know. I am the archives librarian. I have a master's in library and information science, and I am also a certified archivist, which is a national and international accreditation. I got my BA in English literature at UCF, and I am also was a Disney cast member for 10 years. So this information, this presentation is more passion and heart to me because it's something I've been interested in kind of my whole life. And I'm just blessed that we have the material at USF that allows me to do something really, really fun all the time, honestly. So just a little bit about USF Tampa Special Collections. We use primary source materials. We preserve and providing access to rare, unique, and strategic collections of significance. We do have 5 strategic collecting areas, which are, of course, our university archives, Florida studies, Florida environmental and natural history, LGBTQ studies, and our children's and young adult literature collections, which is where the books that are on the table here are from our children's and young adult literature collections, which is a collection that has about 25,000 titles. There's stuff like pop-up books and picture books, dime novels, if anyone remembers those, as well as different toy and young adult literature books now. And then the artwork that you'll see here is from the Mackin Collection of American Humor and Cartoon Art. It was a private donation that was given to us by Dr. Charles Mahan. He was the dean of our College of Public Health, and he's also a USF professor emeritus. This was his passion project as a child. He used to write animators, and they would send him some of the pieces you see on the table, as well as when he was adult, he would go to auctions and buy pieces. And then around the late 1990s, when one of the really bad hurricanes came in, his house got flooded, and he was really concerned about the preservation of all this really unique animation. And that's when he donated it to us at USF. And I've just been privileged enough to be the caretaker of it. So that's where that material has come from that you'll see today. And basically the objective of this presentation is to explore the origins and themes of classic fairy tales, examine the key differences and what was, I don't want to say original because the origins, as we'll discuss, it's really hard to pin down where the original stories came from. But comparing that with our Disney adaptations that we know today, as well as discussing the cultural impacts of both of these adaptations. So let's start by looking at the origins of fairy tales. Like I said, it's really hard to pin down where exactly the first person that ever told one of these tales was from, what time period it was, because it's rooted in oral storytelling. Way before things were written down, people in their local communities would just be sitting around campfires telling stories. Sometimes they were for entertainment, sometimes they were for words of warning to caution the younger children in the village. This is why most of fairy tales have a moral message. It was more for just entertainment, but also to kind of like pass on wisdom to other people in the village or society. So then things started being written down on paper, and of course that happened with people who were educated. Usually those are royal figures in royal courts. Most significantly in the French court, people were writing down stuff for entertainment, reading them in French court. Most famously Charles Perrault, and several female authors were actually really well renowned for writing down fairy tales and publishing them within their circles. And then of course you have the Brothers Grimm, and their take was a little bit different because they would travel around versus just regurgitating information and writing it down for entertainment. They actually would travel around because they wanted to preserve the cultural significance that folk tales and fairy tales were for them as a society. And then all of this whole time, these stories were actually written for adults. They were not really intended for children, again, just outside of like whoever was there to listen, but they were written for adults. I don't want to say adult entertainment because that has different connotations, but it was written for adults' ears. So what ended up happening was around the Enlightenment and Victoria eras, there became this idolization of childhood as an innocence period. And so people who had written fairy tales in the past started revising their tales aimed at children One, because of this whole new enlightenment going forward, but also because children's book market was growing. And that's not really any different than from today, right? There's a lot of adult fiction authors who have chosen to switch to writing young adult and children literature because that's where they're going to sell the most material, to be honest. It kind of came down to, I can make more money off my writing if I gear this towards children and not just adults. So that's kind of where they shifted to thinking of like child's fairy tales, Tales of Mother Goose, things like that started being marketed for children. And some of the main things you're going to see in these original fairy tales is that they are still very dark. Even when they were tweaked a little bit to be written for children, they're still, I don't think a lot of them would pass for children's literature that's written today. I think there would be some questions from some publishers if people were writing about some of these things for children. But they really also reflected kind of the harsh realities of life that people were experiencing. So they do tend to be very dark and violent. There's a lot of violent deaths in really the worst way possible. I'm talking like mutilation, murder, cannibalism, some really nasty stuff. And it all comes from a moral punishment. It's retribution, and it's also done in a lot of gruesome ways. There's also a lot of punishment for and visualization of abuse of power and betrayals that are shown in, again, really grotesque ways. And one of the things that I love most about original fairy tales is symbolism. Again, I'm an English literature major, so symbolisms and allegories are just, I love them. I love trying to figure out what the meaning is. So you'll see a lot of symbolism that's used throughout the original tales, like transformation, which is like interchange and moral rebirth. Stepmothers, which is pretty common. They're always maternal jealousy, fractured family roles. They kind of always end up being the villain. Wolves are representative male predators, hunger and lust. Forests is always depicted as the unknown, going into danger. And then blood, purity, mirror of vanity. And shoes represent usually some sort of journey. And then you have the depiction. So what is a children's story without wonderful children illustrations, right? So below on the bottom of the screen are some of the illustrations that were in these children's books. Some of them aren't too bad, but the one right here where the gentleman's trying to cut the throat of his child, that's Tom Thumb. The one on the corner here is Snow White, and there's just kind of these like very distorted figure dwarfs grabbing at her. The middle one is Beauty and the Beast, where we think of the Beast as this very like gentleman he was represented as a boar and very disfigured. And then of course we have Little Red Riding Hood. We've got the wolf dressed up as grandma in bed with the little girl. And then the very last one on the left-hand corner is Sleeping Beauty. And the original tale, or as far back as you can go for Sleeping Beauty, it was actually a king, not a prince, that this is going to be kind of odd too, but just impregnated her while she was asleep. So that's the depiction there on the bottom left corner. So these were still in children's tales. These were the illustrations from really famous artists like Gustave Dior and Arthur Rackham that are really well known today. These are still around and existing. So just again, these were the depictions that people were seeing of fairy tales. And then we have Disney entering the storybook. So just a little bit background on Disney and Walt Disney Studios. It was started by Walt and Roy in 1923. Their first shorts were Alice's Wonderland, which was actually a mixture of live action and animation. But then they decided that they wanted to do all animation, and in 1927, they jointly created the character Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, as well as their own Walt Disney Studios brand. However, they were selling their cartoons to people who would air them, right? So about a year into this, after writing 26 different animation shorts, because there were no features yet, it was just animation, little clips and shorts of Oswald, he was informed that Oswald did not belong to him anymore, that in his contract from selling those cartoons, he also sold the rights for the image of Oswald, the Lucky Rabbit. So kind of fed up with his pay and his treatment, he went from that contract and had to create a whole other character, which we know today as Mickey Mouse. And then Steamboat Willie, so there were several Mickey Mouse cartoons. He didn't really catch on very much until they broke out of the silent era in animation and started pairing music. into the shorts, and that's where Steamboat Willie became so famous. It was the first cartoon that had music to accompany it. And after that, people just kind of became obsessed with Mickey Mouse. And that was the really big first push into the public eye. And that's also where people say that the golden age of animation was born, was here with Steamboat Willie. Now, we talked a little about the animated shorts. Walt began using fairy tales and nursery rhymes in his collections and silly symphonies. So the things like the Three Little Pigs, the Tortoise and the Hare, the Ugly Duckling. It was not uncommon for really any animation houses that were producing these shorts to use fairy tales as inspiration for any of their animation. But what really made Walt Disney stand out at that time was the way that they told these stories. And the way that was most impactful was their style of storytelling through animation and their ways of innovation and technology. So innovation and technology. By retelling classic tales, the audiences that are familiar with Disney was able to push the boundaries of the technical and artistic innovation. They didn't need to spend a crazy amount of time getting people to know these characters, right? They were already pretty familiar. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had a play, it had a silent film. People knew the story. So that kind of allowed them to be able to push more boundaries on the animation itself. And three things that Walt Disney Studios is really well known for was their use of Technicolor. They developed the process that allowed movies to be produced in vibrant, lifelike colors. And then, of course, in 1937, the very first Technicolor animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, was released. Second, rotoscoping. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this or not. And you may have seen images. There's one here on the bottom of Maleficent and the Prince. Disney was really well known for bringing in live actors and live animals to act out the scenes, to kind of mull around. And the animators would sit there and study every single movement that these people made, the animals made, because they wanted to make the animation as lifelike as possible. Even so much so that they would film it, and then they would sit there on the TV and they would trace over the TV all the movements to get familiar with how someone moved, how someone talked. And it made the storytelling and the animation so much more lifelike, because to this point, animation was not there was like a couple movements, like this, and like it just was very static. So this was really revolutionary for them to be doing, as well as the multiplane camera. So they didn't invent the multiplane camera, but they highly improved it at Disney Studios. And this camera allows for the illusion of depth. So you have different layers that are stacked up here on the film. So you have the backdrop, you have movement, you have the photocell, and all these things are happening at one time. So it really gives the illusion of like a special effect in an animated film. You have like water moving, flickering of lights, all that happening while the animation is moving forward. So these kind of technologies really helped Walt Disney kind of stay in that focus of like their animation, their storytelling was seen more as revolutionary than some other houses at the time. And then, of course, storytelling through animation. Now, these three are taken from the Illusions of Life, 12 Basic Principles of Animation, that was written by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson, which were two of the original Old Nine Men. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but they were the closest animators to Walt at the time. They were his go-to men. And there's actually two pieces on the table by Mark Davis, who is my all-time favorite animator and Imagineer, who was also part of one of those 9 old men. And they kind of wrote the book on how to, again, do that really convincing storytelling. How do you do storytelling through animation? One is the visual. So again, characters are drawn to express a wider range of emotions through their movement, facial expressions, and body language. Also, really pleasing visual elements like the color palettes and environments and props that were used. Characters are developed through their physical appearance, their mannerisms, their interactions with their environment. And the animation really allows for those subtle like nuances that a character, those little ticks that they have. And then emotion, techniques like emotional arcs, character journeys, really powerful music score. All those things influence the emotion and the connection that people are getting with the characters that are being animated when they're watching the short or the featured length film. This wasn't really being done before the Walt Disney Studios started really focusing on how do we really make this come to life for people. So again, there's 12 steps altogether, but these three, more so than the others, really kind of connected people to the tales and made Disney as popular as they really are. So now that we've done a little bit of some origins of fairy tales, a little bit of how Walt Disney Studios started, we're going to look at a few of the tales. We're going to break them down and compare them in these 3 case studies. And the way that we're going to break them down is by looking at 5 very common fairy tale themes. The first one is the characters. There is always a hero, a villain, and some sort of support friend. Those 3 are going to exist no matter what. There might be other supporting characters, but these are the 3 that are always going to be very integral to the story. Of course, magic. It can't be a fairy tale without some sort of magic, right? Obstacles or tasks. There has to be something that the hero has to overcome or complete, as well as a happily ever after. Now, the happily ever after, as we'll see, is a little debatable in my eyes. It depends on, I guess, who you think deserves the happily ever after or what happens in the end. But the hero, for the most part, always gets a happily ever after. And then, of course, there's a moral lesson that has to be found in every single one. So we're going to start with Snow White. Of course, it was the first feature-length film animation for Walt Disney Studios, so it's only apt that we start with this one. And I feel like everyone pretty much knows the tale of Snow White. Is there anyone that's not familiar with Snow White at all, never heard of it, don't know who she is? No? Okay, great. So this, for the most part, has German origins, and it was published for the first time in Grimm's Fairy Tales in 1812. And we're going to compare Disney to the Grimm's version, starting with our characters. So, of course, in both stories, there is a hero, and our hero is Snow White. In the Disney version over here, she's a young adult, maybe an older teenager. In the Grimm's version, she's 7 years old. Just keep that in mind as we move forward. She is 7 years old this whole time. The villain is, of course, the evil stepmother queen, and that's pretty consistent with the Grimms. However, in the very first version, before they again started altering more for publishing for children, it was actually the birth mother who was the villain. And she tried to abandon Snow White out in a field picking flowers because she was growing up too beautiful, and every time she saw her, she just was like, I can't deal with, aging, essentially. So she was going to leave her there, but they felt like, okay, birth mother is a little too harsh. Let's move her to the typical stepmother mentality. So both of those are pretty accurate or similar. And of course, her friends, the dwarfs. Now, in the Grimms, they have no personality. They have no names. They're just kind of there to help her out every once in a while, tell her to stop opening the door to this peddler that keeps coming by, and she doesn't listen. But in the Snow White and Seven Dwarfs animated feature, we all know all 7 dwarfs, right? They all have very distinctive personalities, so much so that they are named after it. Bashful, dopey, sleepy, sneezy, Doc, grumpy, very personable, and have more to do with the story as we move forward as well. So magical and obstacles, both do have a magic mirror. It is almost verbatim, the mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all. Very similar, used in the same exact context. The only difference we start to see is with the attempts to get rid of Snow White. So in the Disney version, there's a huntsman involved, and he's supposed to carve out her heart, right? And then doesn't do that, so then we have the poison apple attempt. Just one attempt on her life after that. In the Grimm's version, we have the huntsman who is supposed to cut out her liver and kidneys so the queen can eat them. And she does eat them, thinking that Snow White has been murdered. And then it comes to, find out the mirror says she's still not the fairest. So she goes as a peddler and tries to sell this little girl a bodice and ties her in so tight that she suffocates and passes out on the floor. And she leaves her there. The dwarfs come and take her and save her, tell her stop opening the door to people. The second attempt, she comes in and poisons a comb and goes to brush her hair. The comb gets stuck in her hair. She drops down dead. The witch leaves. Again, the dwarfs show up, and they're like, you've got to stop opening that door, girl, like, no more. And then the third attempt, of course, is still the apple. Although it's a little bit different, both scenarios, actually not both scenarios, in the apple and the Disney scenario is supposed to put her to sleep. the apple in the Grimms is literally supposed to kill her. Like, there's supposed to be no reviving her after that. And of course, the happily ever after. So both versions have a prince, another supporting character. In the Disney version, they kind of meet beforehand at the wishing well. It's very cute. There's a song. And then he goes after her to find her. And of course, he wakes her up with true love's kiss, right? After they vanquish the witch. And it's really beautiful. And they ride off back to the castle and they're going to get married. In the Grimm's version, the prince does not know Snow White. He's just touring the countryside with all of his servants and happens upon the dwarfs who were putting together this golden glass coffin of this 7-year-old girl and says, "Oh my gosh, I've got to have this girl. She's beautiful. Give her to me." And the dwarfs are like, "No, we don't really want to." And he's like, "No, I will take wonderful care of her. I have to have her." So they give the prince the 7-year-old girl in the coffin, and the servants are carrying her around the countryside on their backs, up and down, all over the place. And how they wake Snow White is one of them is just so exhausted. They're like, "I cannot believe I'm carrying this girl all over the place." They trip and they fall, and the coffin falls and hits the ground, and the piece of apple just pops out of her throat. And she wakes up. And they take the glass off the coffin, and she goes, "Oh, you're my prince. Yes, let's get married. Yes, wonderful." And then they go and they get married. Again, a 7-year-old just wakes up. It's a very, classic heartwarming tale of real love. But then we have the moral of the story. So in Disney, we do see the queen get her demise, right? She falls off a cliff kind of off stage or off camera. And it's actually the dwarfs that do this for her. They try to save her. The dwarfs end up chasing her off the cliff. In Grimm's, the 7-year-old again, wants to invites the mother to their wedding in kind of like a tricky way because she doesn't know yet that Snow White's going to be the new queen. The queen asks the mirror if she's the fairest, and they're like, "Oh, no, because the new queen is going to be the fairest of them all." So the queen's like, "Well, I got to see who this lady is because I might have to take her out too." She shows up to the wedding and realizes that the new queen is her stepdaughter and freezes right there on the spot. And basically it says, "Then they put a pair of iron shoes into burning coals. They were brought forth with tongs and placed before her. She was forced to step into the red-hot shoes and dance until she fell down dead," in front of everyone at the wedding ceremony. And while this is already kind of like not great to have someone sit there and dance to their death, it's even worse when you think that it was a 7-year-old who did this on purpose, invited the mother to the wedding, intentionally prepared the iron in the coals to watch her die. It's a little disturbing. So the moral of the story, for Grimm's anyway, is a warning about vanity and that justice is harsh, and it's also very dark. The moral and the tone of the Disney version is that good triumphs over evil, right? It really reflects the 1930 American values of optimism, virtue, and of course, romance. So now we're going to move to Cinderella, which has a lot of different origins, Greek, Egyptian, Italian, but it was published in French by Charles Perrault in 1697, and then again by the Grimm brothers in 1812. This was released by Walt Disney Pictures in 1950. It was the film that saved them financially after World War II. For many reasons, the studio was struggling, whether people just were not going to the movies, obviously, or maybe the films that they were producing, like Bambi and Dumbo, were just not as popular at the time. But this is what saved their studio, was this Cinderella. And everyone's familiar with Cinderella, right? Great, okay. So we're going to compare all three because they are pretty distinct. Again, our characters, our heroine, of course, is Cinderella. Whether you want to call her a Cinder Witch or a little ash girl, she is the heroine of the story. Then all three stories have the villain of the stepmother and the stepsisters, very consistent. They're cruel. They make fun of her. They make her work. The only difference that I'd like to note here is that in both Perrault and Grimm, the father is still alive this whole time and is just okay with letting his new bride really treat his daughter poorly, which is very interesting to me. And in Disney, of course, he dies off screen and he's passed away and she's left alone, and that's why she's treated so poorly. And then, of course, we have our friends, our people that help our heroine. In both Disney and Perlot, there is a fairy godmother. Of course, Disney's is very characteristic. There's the bippity-boppity-boo. She's very charismatic. In Perlot, she's just kind of there. She kind of shows up, and they're like, oh, fairy godmother. There's no real, like, astonishment. But in the Grimm, the things that help her out is not a fairy godmother, but yet these birds and doves that live in a hazelnut tree next to the grave of her mother, her birth mother. And she usually goes out to the tree to pray for something, for help. And these doves kind of deliver some sort of assistance, whether it's cleaning up things or delivering a dress or a shoe. They're really the ones that are helping her out. And again, your magic and obstacles. So in the Disney version, the obstacle is, of course, she has to get to this ball. She doesn't have anything to wear. She doesn't have transportation. The fairy godmother takes care of all of that for her. And then she gets to the ball. She meets the prince. She falls in love, but she has a time limit. She's got to be back by midnight. And then at the end of the story, when they are trying to fit her with the shoe and they come around, the stepmother actually locks Cinderella in the tower to try to prevent her from trying on the shoe, right? That doesn't happen in the other ones. It is just kind of interesting how it ends up happening. But in the Perlot one, there is a fairy godmother, which we talked about. Both of them consist with transfiguration. So they do change a pumpkin into a coach. They change the mice into coachmen, lizards into footmen. So that happens consistently between the two. But then in both the Grimm and the Perlot, there are multiple balls, multiple events she attends. The midnight curfew's there, but it's not as dramatic as Disney represents it. With the Grimm version, of course, we have the hazelnut tree. That's the magic that's gifting her all this material. And then there's some comical, like, daring escapes. So there's not a midnight curfew, but the prince always tries to walk her home, right? Because he is, like, infatuated with her. And she's always trying to, like, not let him know who she is. So she jumps in like a chicken coop and she, like, pushes him into something else. And he's always trying to figure out, why is this girl, like, ditching me on the side of the road? It's kind of comical. But that happens 3 times before one of the times she finally leaves behind a gold slipper and not a glass slipper like it is in Disney and Perlot. But both follow the same theme. They have this one slipper, and of course this one woman is going to fit into the slipper, and that's going to be the person that I want to marry and that I love. In the Disney version, there's the mice that help her get out of the tower, and she races down to try on the shoe, and the stepmother trips her, and the shoe crashes, and they're like, oh no. But then she pulls out the other shoe, and it fits, and that's all magical and wonderful. Pretty much the same thing in the other two, but it's really less exciting. They kind of just show up with the shoe, and in the Perlot version, the sisters try it, and they're like, these don't fit. And they're like, Cinderella, you try. And they're like, oh, that's hilarious. Yeah, try it, Cinderella. And then the shoe fits, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is who I love, and they go get married. Very anticlimactic, in my opinion. The Grimm version is a little bit more interesting in the fact that the stepsisters are trying to fit their big feet into this tiny shoe. And by the suggestion of the mother, she tells them to cut off their toes to try to fit into the heel, and then also try to cut off the heel to chip it into the shoe. So they just have this bloody stump of a foot trying to fit into this shoe. And no one else notices that there's blood everywhere until they're about to leave, and the birds, of course, come in, and they're like, no, if there's blood, it's not a true princess. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're right. She don't fit into these shoes. Who else is in here? And they're like, oh, well, there's this Cinder girl. And again, the father is like, there's no way it's her. You're wasting your time. And sure, come to find out, she comes and tries on the shoe, and it magically fits. And they go off and they get married. How wonderful. So the ending. In the Disney version, you don't really see what happens to the stepmother and the stepsisters. They just kind of ride off. You know, she's got her shoe on, and there's a big wedding scene, and it's beautiful. And again, that kind of moral is like dreams and kindness and patience lead to happiness, and it's light and romantic and hopeful. All the things that you would want to experience after a war, right? You want something light. You want something hopeful for people to watch. The Perlot ending is, again, really anticlimactic. It's she goes to get married, and then she helps her sisters get married to dukes and lords. And they all live in the castle together, which I don't know if I'd want to live with people who were trying to ruin my life, but you know. But the really great thing about Charles Perrault is you don't even have to guess what the moral is. He literally writes it out word for you. He doesn't want you to guess. He wants to tell you exactly what he means. And the moral of that story is beauty in a woman is a rare treasure that will always be admired. Graciousness, however, is priceless and even greater value. That is what Cinderella's godmother gave to her when she taught her to behave like a queen. Young women, in the winning of a heart, graciousness is more important than a beautiful hairdo. It is a true gift of the fairies. With it, nothing is possible. With it, no one can do anything. Another moral, as if one was not enough. Another moral, without doubt, it is a great advantage to have intelligence, courage, good breeding, and common sense. These and similar talents come only from heaven, and it is good to have them. However, these may fail to bring your success without the blessing of a godmother or a godfather. So, elegant, forgiving, she forgives her stepsisters. I know, right? But then the Grimm version it starts off kind of nice. She invites her stepmother and stepsisters to the wedding. But then as the stepsisters are walking her down the aisle the first way, the birds return and start pecking out the eyes of the stepsisters as they're walking down the aisle. They get married. They turn to walk down the aisle. The birds peck out the other eye from the other side. And that's the ending of the story. So the sisters are blinded. Again, the moral justice is served through divine and natural forces, right? Because so the birds are kind of represented as the spiritual conveyors of the mother, the dead mother. So good is rewarded, evil is punished. Again, the tone very dark, moralistic, and folkloric. And then in Sleeping Beauty, so French origins, again, really kind of questionable because there's a lot of tales that deal with a sleeping woman. But the first published was the French version by Charles Perrault, again in 1697, and then by the Grimms in 1812. It was released by Walt Disney in 1959 and was considered one of their most artistically acclaimed features because of the medieval style of the backgrounds that were done for the movie. It was kind of revolutionary with the very I don't want to say Art Deco, but the French way, the medieval way of doing the art at the time. So again, our characters, we have a woman who falls asleep. In Perrault, she doesn't even have a name. She's not worth a name. In Grimm, she's called Little Briar Rose. And of course, in Disney, she's called Aurora, sometimes Briar Rose when she's undercover, living in the cottage, with her 3 magical fairies that are there to protect her. The villain, in all of them, there is a bad fairy. In Disney, we know her to be Maleficent. She is a really well thought out character in the Disney version. She is the only villain in the Disney version and plays a huge part in causing menace in that film. However, in the Perrault version, she's just kind of unnamed. There were a total of 7 fairies. She's number 7. She's the bad one. Of course, she gets mad that she's not invited to this party because apparently they didn't have enough cutlery. They didn't have gold plates, so that's why they didn't invite her. And she shows up and she claims that this young girl, this new baby princess, is going to prick her finger and die. And then, of course, the last fairy who was hiding can't undo the magic, but says she'll fall asleep instead. Pretty consistent. That's even the story that Disney uses. But in the Grimm version, there are 13 fairies. And of course, the villain is number 13, unlucky number 13. Again, doesn't get invited to a party and gets really upset and has this curse thrown out. And of course, there are the fairies. There are, again, 6 in one, 12 in the other. There's 3 with Disney. All 3 have the curse. They're pretty consistent. It happens with a spindle. By pricking her finger, they'd make every attempt to hide all the spindles from Aurora. However, people have to have clothes in this kingdom, right? That's how you make clothing back then. So they kind of have this one woman up in a tower who's spinning, In the Perlot version, she's just this really sweet old lady who the unnamed princess finds, and she tries to teach her how to make clothing and accidentally pricks her finger, and she falls asleep. In the Grimm version, it is the unnamed villain fairy who is causing this, who kind of is undercover as this woman who brings the spindle in, and she pricks her finger. In the Disney version, she's kind of under this hypnosis, again from Maleficent, trying to lure her into the tower. And of course, all three of them, all kingdoms fall asleep. Again, the same story. The only difference here is that the obstacles in Perlot and Grimm is just some thorn hedges that have been keeping people out for like 100 years. But whenever the prince shows up, they just magically change either into rose bushes or they just part and let him in magically. Really no obstacle, honestly, when you think about it. In Sleeping Beauty, or in the Disney version, of course, we have this huge fight scene with Maleficent. She turns into a dragon. She's defending the tower. Huge obstacle for the prince to overcome, to then wake up Sleeping Beauty with, again, true love's kiss. In the Perlot version, he just shows up and she wakes up. She just walks into the room, falls on his knees because she's so beautiful. And she wakes up and she's like, "Oh, are you my prince? It's you." That's about it. In the Grimm version, he does kiss her to wake her up, but that's more of a like premonition. They're like, after 100 years, somebody will show up and kiss her and she'll wake up. Nothing to do with love, no true love's kiss, no nothing. And then the Grimm ends pretty boring for a Grimm fairy tale. They just get married and they have some kids, and that's about it. Now, in the Disney version, it's kind of the same thing. She wakes up, the kingdoms wake up, they have this really cute little dance, and her, dress changes colors. In the Perlot version, it goes really off the rails. Like, she wakes up, they get married, she ends up having 2 children with this prince named Dawn and Day. They are a lot of names, she still is unnamed. But the prince is keeping her secret. He goes back home and doesn't tell his parents that he gets married until a couple years that the king finally dies and he's about to become king. So he goes and gets his bride and 2 children, brings them to the kingdom, and then has to go away to war, and come to find out his mother is an ogress and doesn't like the fact that there's going to be a new queen because now her son is taking over as king, and decides that she's going to eat the Sleeping Beauty and the 2 children because she's an ogress and she's got this craving for flesh that's been awakened apparently. So she has the cook try to go slaughter the daughter and the 2 kids. Of course, the servant doesn't do that. He ends up killing lamb and things and making her think that she's eating these people. But then the queen finds out because she hears them talking in the castle and gets really upset. So she gets this huge cauldron out and throws in like serpents and snakes and toads, and she's going to throw them in there and boil them right in front of the whole kingdom. But at this time, the king shows up, who is her son, and is like, "What are you doing? Like, what's going on here? What's happening?" And out of just fear, like chaos, and just like trying to get away from him, she jumps into the vat of snakes and serpents herself and dies. And you're just kind of there like, why? What just happened? Like, this is so left field. Come to find out, it's kind of left over from an even earlier version where there was a king who impregnated her while she was asleep, and he was married to this ogress mother, and that was kind of her way of trying to get rid of this new woman that had children. So they, for some reason, just decided to leave it in. But again, Perlot gives us a great moral to the story. He says, "Many a girl has waited long for a husband brave or strong, but I have never met any sort of woman yet who would wait 100 years. Free from fretting, free from fears, now our story seems to show that a century or so, late or early, matters not. True love comes by fairy lot. Some old folk will even say it grows better by delay. Yet this good advice, I fear, helps us neither there nor here, though philosophers may prate how much wiser 'tis to wait. Maids will be a good sighting still. Young blood must win, young blood will." And I can tell you what I think that means, but I would rather hear what you guys think in a little bit. So again, the French is very elegant, refined, but then kind of goes off the deep end in this dark period. The grim, where's the grim factor? Nothing really happens here. In a rare occurrence, their moral is patience and fate guide life's course. What's meant to happen will happen in proper time. And of course, our Disney version is true love conquers all, good versus evil, true love's kiss, romantic, dramatic, and whimsical. So now I want to talk a little bit, now that we've compared both the original fairy tales and the Disney versions, talk about the cultural impact of Disney. Now, does anyone here have a really strong memory about Disney, whether it's animation or a visit to the theme parks, something that is a really great memory that they like to share with people? Maybe you share with your children, maybe you want to take your children to go or watch a movie or go to a theme park. Like, how many of us have a really great Disney memory? Show of hands, anyone? But say just me, because am I the only Disney person in this room? That's crazy. Right. So that's really a type of emotional connection that people get from childhood viewings that creates lifelong associations. And these memories are then passed down from parents to children, reinforcing the Disney versions as the true and authentic ones. We have children watch on Disney Plus the Disney versions. They see it on TV. They go to the theme parks. They meet the princesses. They read all of the books. Fairy tale books now are the Disney princesses. The Grimm fairy tales are not as popular as they once were. And that really is because Disney, all the things we talked about before with the animation and the storytelling, but Disney really maintains the story and image of their themes through retellings, books, movies, TV shows, merchandise, and theme parks. Disney merchandising, if anyone's interested, I have a really great story about Walt Disney that I learned in Disney Traditions when I worked there a long time ago about his marketing mindset. But it's really been happening from the 1930s. He was very smart about marketing. And they have things like the World of Color, if anyone remembers that, Wide World of Disney. All these things were on TV to promote the Disney merchandise, the Disney stories, the Disney theme parks. And they really control the images of the princesses and the things we see. They are copywritten, they are trademarked. You cannot make a figure without thinking that it's the Disney princess that you see, the Disney Snow White in the yellow and blue dress, the Belle in the blue golden dress. All of that is Disney so well controlled, the visuals that you see through all of their copyrights and their trademarks. As well as Disney just popularized the idea that family entertainment should include moral clarity, minimal violence, and a happy ending. So now this is really the format that is followed by all the animation studios. So the animation studios that make Shrek and Swan Princess, they saw the Disney way and saw how successful it was and really just kind of follow that lead. And so again, that's why these stories are so impacted into us with in our culture at this point. And so they all lived happily ever after, right? So Disney adaptations refined fairy tales for the 20th and 21st centuries. Disney fairy tales are more than just entertainment. They are cultural artifacts that both reflect and shape societal views. Their influence is vast, but both original and Disney versions offer cultural value. Fairy tale adaptations continue to be popularized through things like twisted tales and retellings through literature and media. And each creator adapting traditional tales and figures reflect their own morals and experiences. So retellings are not something that is new. It's not Disney specific. There's a lot of books that are retelling. There's a lot of TV shows that are retelling, like Once Upon a Time. A lot of young adult books are retellings of like dystopian Cinder. There's like Cinderella, but she's an android. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on that's been popularized. So it's not just Disney. But Disney has become what everyone sees at this point. And the items here were from an exhibit that I did last year called Disney Inspirations. That was more on fairy tales, but also there was Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Pinocchio, and Bambi, stuff that was done. So now I'd like to open it up to questions. If anyone wants to discuss anything, if you have any questions about the presentation or the artwork, or if you have a Disney version that shaped your view of fairy tales. Like, when you think of Cinderella, do you think of the Disney version, or do you think of a different version? I'd be interested to hear anyone's thoughts. So, yes.
Do you know anything about the Egyptian
Yeah, there's always a telling about, it's really always about the shoe, like the journey again. There's always some sort of story about a girl who loses a shoe. And it was also usually treated really poorly. So again, it's about that abuse of power. It's usually just a different setting. Sometimes they're really short too, which is why the tellings, there's so many, like if you look through some of these books, there's books like, or there's stories that you almost think could have been Snow White or could have been something else because they get so close because they're using the exact same format of the heroine, the obstacle, the magic, the things that they knew and were like familiar with. So a lot of stories get very familiar. I don't know the whole story on that, but it always seems to connect back to a girl who is abused by some betrayal, power, and a shoe, or some sort of footwear, let's put it that way, or slipper or something that is lost and has to be returned. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other? Yes.
I really want to know about the story about Disney's marketing, like, because you mentioned.
Oh, yeah. So, as I mentioned before, I was a Disney cast member for 10 years. I worked the attractions. So I started at Tower of Terror. I did Rock and Roller Coaster. I did Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean. And every time you start working with Disney, you go through something called Disney Traditions, where they teach you all about Walt Disney, animation, the theme parks. And they tell us this story about Walt actually in like a Walgreens. He was just there picking up medicine. And he was looking around and saw that the Disney stuff, the Mickey Mouse stuff they started producing, was at the bottom shelf. And so he literally just went in and cleared off the top shelves and just moved all the Disney stuff to eye level everywhere he went. Anytime he was at a store and saw that the Disney merchandise was not in the prime location, he'd move it himself because he believed in merchandising and marketing had that much of an impact on people. So he would do, Walt was a big, and I don't want to get too Walt person because Walt, just like everybody, has his own flaws, but he really was a person to do the work. Like there's stories of the trash cans in Walt Disney World. There's always one that's at every 100 feet. And Walt would literally go around and pick up the trash as he was walking the parks. He was not above doing any of that work, which I think is a credit to him as a person. So yeah. But that's always a fun story to me. I think about it when I'm shopping, that all the Disney stuff is always like right at eye level. And I'm like, Walt started that. Yes.
I've always associated Disney with, great moral characters
Mhm.
and moral messages. When my kids were, not my kids were in their 30s now, mid to late 30s, you started to hear about different subliminal messages and stuff like that. And you heard, I don't know if those rumors, but there were some things that you did see certain words written in smoke and, stuff like that in the castle. How has that changed over the years? Like, where is, of course, Walt Disney's dead.
Mm-hmm.
So carrying on his theme of great moral character, has that changed now, do you think?
I don't think it's changed. I think, because I mean, I grew up in a time where that stuff was happening during what we call the Renaissance period of like the Little Mermaid, the figure on the castle, Aladdin, what was said. And I think some of it is speculation. I think also some of it is just the animators themselves. And yeah, there is actually a more popular story with, I believe it's Nickelodeon. The animators who were doing Rocko's Modern Life were just like, they were over the politics that were going on at the time within the studio. And they were just putting in all kinds of inside jokes for adults because they were just, it was kind of like their way of rebelling in a way. And I think with Disney, it was kind of the same thing happening. Like with every place, there's politics going on, there's changes going on. And when you're animating, it's a lot of work. And I think sometimes there's just people just kind of, it's their way of protesting or trying to liven things up in a way. I think that's what ends up happening. I don't think the moral or the morality of Disney has changed. I think if anything, it's just always enforced all the time. But we're human beings, right? We can't be perfect 100% of the time. We make poor judgment calls all the time with things. And I think that's just a time where that happened, where there was probably also less monitoring and what's the word I'm looking for? Like just making sure, watching all the film, watching all the sketches every day, because Walt was meticulous. If there was something that was not perfect to him, he'd throw it out and say, start over again, start over again. And that Renaissance period was, they were suffering. Like Black Cauldron, all that was not making money for them. They were like in that dark age period is what they call it. They were suffering. So when they started making hits, I think they had to kind of like reinstate themselves on like the quality of what they were doing and quality control of what was going out. And I think some people were missing that, and that's how some of that stuff got in there.
So who's running Disney now?
A bunch of different people. There are so many. Yeah, no, there's not one Walt anymore. There is, someone who's over all of it, but then there's people who are over the parks. There are people who are over the marketing. There are people who are over animation in California. I mean, there's so many people. I mean, Bob Iger is the head at this point, but there's so many people. Disney encompasses so much. I was talking to a person who is the head of the resource library at Yellow Shoes, which is the Orlando Disney Center for any kind of marketing and archive for like Florida. And there's just so many people that have their hands in one project. It's insane. And like big names too. It's not just like some head up there doing a whole lot of nothing. Like there's so many people on projects, and they are looking so far ahead that they're looking at projects that will be built in like 20 years. They're working on innovation. They're working on technology that's going to show up in a park somewhere in 20 years. That's how far ahead they are with their planning. So yeah, so Bob Iger is the face of Disney. He is the president. But there's so many people involved now that it's not just one kind of control, where Walt really was in everything. He touched everything, from animation to the parks to merchandise, literally everything, which is insane to me. Yeah. Yes.
So to go back to your moral summary of the one that you didn't give us your opinion on.
Oh.
So what was your take on that one?
My take on that is that it's about abstinence.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty clear. It's talking about waiting, even if you have to wait 100 years. And the purity that's in that, for specifically towards girls and being pure. But I guess for me, I don't like to tell people like, this is what it is. I want people to come to their own conclusions on stuff, which is where I think Perla is so funny, because he's like, I'm going to tell them exactly what the moral of my story is. They don't need a second guess. This is it. But I, again, an English literature major who loves symbolism and allegory, I like people to come to their own conclusions, their own ideas, before I just willingly tell mine, and that's the only thing you are going to think about now. So, but yeah, it's definitely, yeah, from my opinion, it's about abstinence.
All right, go for it.
Sure.
I know that there's fairy tales across all cultures, all countries, but just in general, the classics, are the females the primary character?
Yes and no. I mean, there are some fairy tales, that have male characters that are the protagonists. So like Hansel and Gretel, there's siblings, there's a male and a female, Tom Thumb. There are male characters. It just always tends to kind of like gravitate towards females. And again, I can give my opinion why. But it's almost like in the person's mind, the females need more of a morale check and need to be warned more about what to be cautious of. Again, that's just my personal opinion on it from reading it. But there are male characters for sure, yeah.
Hercules was the male character that.
Yeah, that's Greek mythology, but Disney related, yeah, that's a male character, a male hero. It's based off of Greek mythology. They didn't just make Hercules up at all. It's based off of, they changed a lot, but it's based off Greek mythology for sure.
There's a lot of tales about like princes who have to go through trials.
Yeah. So it just, especially at least in Disney's, I'm trying to think of like a true fairy tale that has a male character as a, yeah, I'm thinking like Disney feature films. Now Disney does have a version that's Mickey Mouse as Jack, and it's adorable. But And there's, oh, I had it in the slide. There we have some sketches of the giant from that tale at the library. But yeah, there are some tales of like the boys tend to be more mischievous. It's more about keeping them out of trouble because boys will be boys or whatever, and they are causing trouble and they gotta learn a lesson. So it's more adventurous. It's more mischievous for boys, and for girls, it's more like whimsical fairy tales, and learning a lesson to be cautious and careful, essentially, and waiting for true love. Yeah.
If you can remember the moral
Yep.
consequences of Pinocchio, they're like, and
Oh,
the
geez,
boys
that-
are so rowdy, and then they get drunk, and because of the alcohol, they turn into donkeys.
That's another book that when the writer wrote that book, he's Italian, he was not writing it for children. They just marketed it as something, a children's book, because it would sell better. But that book is crazy. That is not a kid's book. There is some, and even the Pinocchio, the Disney adaptation, like Pleasure Island, even that's like pushing the envelope a little bit. But that book is like off the rails. And he was, I think, if I remember correctly, he was actually kind of upset that it was going to be marketed for kids. And Bambi the same way. Bambi was not written for children. I mean, the person that wrote that was not thinking about children in mind when they were writing that book either. But it just got marketed for children because it was a story about a little deer. Again, not putting a whole lot of editors weren't putting a whole lot of thought into what they were publishing back in the day, I guess. But yes, I did forget to mention that. Thank you so much. Even though we are a part of an academic institution, we are on the Tampa campus, we are open to the public. You do not need to be a student. You do not need to be a faculty member to access any of these collections. We do a lot with the community. We have a lot of community archives, and it is for everyone. Anyone who wants any interest, please feel free to come to Special Collections and look at anything we have. Do not feel shy.
They take brochures.
Yeah.
They do incredible exhibits, like you saw. This is part of an exhibit that you guys had there.
Yes, it was one I did last year called Disney Inspirations. The hardest part about it is finding parking. That's the hardest part about getting into Special Collections on the Tampa campus is parking. After that, it's a breeze. So please come see me.